May we start?
I want to get your opinion on something.
To the bigger picture. Now it's time.
From B Media Production, this is Podcasting Essentials.
Hi, and welcome to Episode 7, Season 3. I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of B Media Production. This episode, we hear from a pioneer in the world of branded podcasts, someone early on who understood how engaging podcasts are and their commercial potential. Carolyn Walker was instrumental in getting Hackable, a podcast from McAfee, into our earbuds. We hear from her shortly, but first, I'd like to welcome my co-host, Chris Ashmore.
G'day, Nick. You know, I'm really excited about Google these days. You know, Google's added podcasts into the Google search with a play button.
I know, it's exciting.
It's fantastic. You know, before, it was so difficult to check out a podcast. Now, if you just do a Google search, it comes up, like with Podcasting Essentials, and you can play there and then, which allows you to then go, if you like it, go straight to your iPhone or smartphone and just subscribe to it if it's something that you're interested in. Before, what did you have to do? You had to go and open iTunes and wait for that and then click on this and that and whatever, and it just took forever. So I think it's excellent for the world of podcasting.
Yeah, it's huge for discoverability, particularly for those who have never listened to a podcast. It's going to pop up at the top of a search and they can, with one click, hit a play button. And add to that the fact that Apple Podcasts now has a web interface, which means you can listen also directly from within the browser rather than having to click through to open up iTunes if you're on a desktop. So again, it's one click playing. So both Google and Apple both making it easier for people to listen to podcasts, which is a great thing.
It is a good thing, but one little experiment that I did with the Google search, as good as it is, you can get lost in their own system if you click on the podcast itself, and you get this playlist where there's no way to get out of there. If you want to go to the company's website, if it's not in the show notes, you can't get there. But more importantly, if it's in the description of the show itself, if there's no URL that directs the listener or the user to your website, there's no way to get out of there unless you start to type in things in the browser. So I think it might be a good idea in the description of the show to direct people to your website is to put the URL in that website. You probably should be doing that anyway.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, moving along, last episode we mentioned that we're working on some exciting projects, and we can announce that we have launched Melbourne Food and Wine, a podcast for the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival. And it's centred around, as you know, Chris, the event they ran during the festival this year in March called the Theatre of Ideas. And do you want to tell me a little bit more about the first few episodes that have been launched?
Well, it's what it is are fantastic speakers from all over the world that have come to Melbourne in the month of March for the Theatre of Ideas. It's hosted by New York Times food editor Sam Sifton. It has restaurateurs from Montreal and different places of the world, including Australia. And the things they talk about on stage are worth capturing for an audience that can't get to Melbourne or for that event. There should be more of this. I mean, there's some fantastic stories that are being told in front of live audiences, and if only we could capture them. Well, we can, and repurposing it as a podcast, it's a no-brainer, and it's really good, so check it out.
Head to our show notes for a link.
Yes. But that's not all we're doing. And coming up in future episodes, we'll tell you a few of the other excellent audio that we're doing with brands and what that means for their audiences and their markets.
We will. Now, moving along, who are you talking to today?
Well, Carolyn Walker is the marketing genius behind Hackable, as you mentioned, Nick, a branded podcast for McAfee. She's from an award-winning marketing agency based in Connecticut in the United States, Response Marketing. And it was her idea to approach McAfee about creating a branded podcast series. And for those who don't know, but I'm sure most listeners do know, McAfee is a global computer security software company from the United States. So software security and all those things, it's kind of hard to make a story out of. It's not the sexiest or the most exciting kind of topic, but they did it. And they've done it quite cleverly, like the show Mythbusters.
I love that show.
It's fantastic. They try to work out what can be hackable. So anything from drones in the sky, ting, they're hackable.
A little scary, but yep.
Yeah, of course, to your computers, to your iPhones. But there's one really funny episode where they hack a smart TV, where they've set up one of the staff on the Hackable podcast. He's a football fanatic, a soccer fanatic, and he's watching a Premier League game. And about 10 minutes before the end of the game, and it's as with most soccer games, they're quite close, they hack into his smart TV and he just loses the plot. He gets quite emotional and angry, and they switch the program to I think the nature program or something like that, and you can hear them laughing. It's a bit of a cross between Mythbusters and the old Candid Camera or Punk'd.
Yeah.
It's hilarious, and it's so engaging, and it's no wonder it's done so well. So in this interview, Carolyn says it was her love of listening to podcasts which made her approach McAfee to consider podcasting as a potential content marketing tool. Here's the interview.
I recognize the power of the medium for longer format content that could really intimately connect consumers with brands if it was done right. And what I mean by if it was done right is being entertaining first and foremost. I think that is a critical part of branded podcasts, being good and being successful. The other couple of things that I saw as a listener myself, and I got in when Serial came on the scene and exploded like a lot of other people did, I realized that the channel was really in this kind of rapid high growth phase. And so I thought that could be really interesting for the brands that we work with. And then the other thing, kind of, again, based on my own listenership and connecting with other people that were listening to podcasts as well, I realized there was something kind of special about the audience. And we know now that the audience is very loyal. They're, a little more affluent. They're a bit younger. They're educated. And we have lots of clients who have customers who we consider to be defined as luxury light. And so there's definitely this crossover between who our brand customers are, our client customers are, and who podcast listeners are.
Well, if we can perhaps look at one of the first clients or companies that you helped get into podcasting with McAfee, and the podcast Hackable. How did Hackable come about? What is it? Whose idea was it? And in the beginning, were there any stumbling blocks? Did it take a lot of convincing to get it across the line?
So Hackable came about on a plane ride, believe it or not. So I was on my way out to California to go do client visits in Silicon Valley. And on the plane, I was reading an article about podcasting and the growth of podcasting and how brands were starting to dip their toes in the podcasting water. And I had a bit of an aha moment, and it really became apparent to me that a branded podcast could potentially help McAfee. And the reasons that were kind of spinning around in my head were that, as a marketer of McAfee, we kind of had this persistent challenge in marketing security software, which is that people generally tend to set it and forget it and not really want to engage in a conversation with the brand about cybersecurity or, their security habits or, what best practices are, anything like that. Yet we know from all of the research that McAfee has and, just intuition alone too, is that the best line of defense in protecting yourself online and protecting your computer is education, right? Is being informed about, what to do and what not to do. And so, we have this predicament that people don't want to really hear about it or talk about it, yet the best thing to do is just that, is to actually talk about it. And the only time people, as you can imagine, really care about security software is when something goes wrong, right? When they are hacked, when they become a victim of identity theft. And so it doesn't give you that many opportunities to engage in a conversation. And so I thought that this was a great way for McAfee to kind of have a more long-form conversation with consumers or prospective consumers about cybersecurity in a way more entertaining and engaging way. And so I landed in California, and my first meeting was with McAfee. It was a lunch meeting. And I didn't have anything prepared other than the thoughts in my head about this opportunity. And so I came very close to saying nothing, to tell you the truth, because I didn't even have a slide. I had nothing. And I said, you know what do I have to lose? This is a great idea. It's a hot space. It solves a problem for McAfee. I might as well, throw it out there. And I talked to the client about it, and she loved it. She loved the idea, mainly because it did kind of address this issue, but the timing was also really right for them as well, in that McAfee was separating from Intel Security, or Intel. And so Intel sold off 51% of their McAfee holding to a private equity investment firm. So things were changing at McAfee, and they were kind of reestablishing themselves as more independent from Intel. And so that was a big deal. And they were also got very customer focused at that same time. And this podcast was, something that really it was almost like a gift to their customer, right? Like, it's this really great piece of valuable, entertaining content. And so there was, a lot of intrigue about that too. We immediately started doing lots of research about how are other, not just brands, but how are other podcasts doing it, right? What are the distribution methods? What's the production like? How do we know if it's working or not? So what are the analytics like? And one of the things that we did, we found Pacific Content, and I know you know those guys up in Canada, and realized that they have this expertise in audio storytelling and working specifically with brands. And so we ended up partnering with them to do the production. It was about a year in the making of planning and doing, a strategic workshop with the folks at McAfee down in Plano, Texas, coming up with the name, figuring out the launch plan, creating the pilot, testing the pilot. It was a massive undertaking. So there were a few things that we wanted to achieve, positioning McAfee as a thought leader in the space, and for people to look at McAfee as, the experts in cybersecurity. So that was another. And also, I would say it was looked at as, and still is looked at as, a piece of content that is a benefit to their existing customer base. So, there was this goal of getting their current customers to listen to it and to help their current customers have a good impression of McAfee. And so in all of those aspects, it has been incredibly successful. It's been incredibly successful in terms of downloads and subscribers. We are in the top 1% of all podcasts ever produced based on the number of downloads we get with each episode in the first 30 days of release, which is great, and we have a huge subscriber base, which is wonderful. But not only that, we have had countless listeners write to us to tell us how much they enjoy it and give us ideas for future episodes. And not only we're hearing them through email and our website, but we're seeing the same kind of sentiment on the ratings and reviews in Apple Podcasts and the other platforms. But I think more importantly than all of that, I had mentioned a little bit earlier that we had taken the pilot episode out to consumers for some research and get their feedback. And we asked them questions both before and after listening. And I seriously had to pinch myself when we got the numbers back, because our brand recall which, by the way, McAfee is very lightly branded. It's only mentioned once or twice in each episode, was exceptionally strong, as well as the sentiment scores. The sentiment scores were through the roof. And to me, that was just a massive indication that we had something incredibly special and tremendously brand building for McAfee.
If we move away from Hackable and maybe look at more generally podcasting for brands, from what you've done over these years advising on podcasting and marketing with podcasting, what are your tips for brands that are looking to create a podcast?
Yeah, number one, be incredibly strategic and purposeful. So don't just jump on the bandwagon because that's what you see other brands doing. It really isn't for everybody. If the podcast or the idea of a branded podcast supports your business strategy, then great. If it doesn't, then, don't try it. It's probably not the right thing for you. Two is the storytelling component, I think, is really, really important. And so have really great stories to tell. Listeners will tune out if you treat your podcast like a 30-minute, sales pitch. There's no way it's going to work. So figure out what the storytelling angle is around subject matter that relates to your brand and tell those great stories. I'd say third, which is really important and something I learned early on, is that you really need to think and act like an entertainment company. The production value and quality really matters. The story, the host, the sound effects, the editing are all critical to embellishing that story and entertaining your listeners. You should look at your competitors and how your competitors are doing it. And if there are no direct competitors, then just listen to other branded podcasts and quality branded podcasts and see how they're doing it. I know I've talked to a lot of clients and other brands that think that they can just put 2 microphones out in front of a couple of their employees and think that they can make a podcast. And it's just not going to resonate and get the traction that you really want it to get. Just a few more I think are really important is to consider the long-term view and what the long-term plan is for the podcast. So you got to plan for multiple seasons, hopefully, and plan for this podcast to have, it's like almost another asset to the brand, right? And so how are you going to continue to support that asset over time in multiple seasons? I would suggest too that, anyone that gets into the branded podcast space should do some research like we did, and it really will help them understand if they have a hit on their hand or a miss. And it definitely could potentially help you guide your strategy going forward, or, help you rework things to make it better and stronger. Thinking about how you're going to go to market with it is massively important. Consider a 360 launch plan where you're, using paid, earned, owned, and internal to support the podcast and get it off the ground. We recognized early with Hackable that we weren't going to get people to come into the podcasting space because of Hackable. We knew that we had to get current podcast listeners to listen to Hackable as, another one of their 7 or 8 podcasts that they listen to on a normal basis. And so, think about that, right? And how are you going to reach those podcast listeners and let them know that you've got another piece of great content to share with them?
Just on that, with launching the podcast, it's been a few years since you launched Hackable. A, how did you launch? And B, what you know now, would you have launched differently?
So we did launch with a full 360 plan. We were very heavy with in-podcast advertising, and advertising is in quotes,
Right.
because it really was more like in podcast sponsored content or endorsed content. We also launched pretty heavily with social advertising because in social we could get really granular with who we were targeting. So we were able to target our ads to people who were interested in podcasts or certain podcast titles and things like that. We were able to do a lot with McAfee's own assets. So, publicizing it on their website, in their blog posts, in their newsletters, in their emails, using every bit of their owned assets to help promote it. And we also did a really great job letting the internal teams know. So McAfee, as you know, is a global company with tens of thousands of employees. And so we had a plan to communicate out to the employees and use their social champs to help spread the word, not only internally, but also out to their social bases as well. So it was a really comprehensive plan, really well thought through, incredible assets we created to, beautiful, engaging assets to use, to tell that story about the podcast. I'd say the only thing that we would do differently, I think, would be to have a little more PR support behind the launch.
Traditional PR?
Yes, traditional PR, but also having that kind of entertainment eye and spin on it. We really worked hand in hand with the hosts and the producers of the shows that we ended up identifying and wanted to be in. And the creative of the quote unquote advertising did end up more like in podcast content. And I think that was one of the critical success factors of Hackable, was having advertising that was more like content than advertising in podcast, especially in Reply All. That was just an awesome execution where one of the Reply All hosts actually interviewed our host, Jeff, and asked him about the name Hackable and why there was a question mark in the name. And it was fantastic. It was just like a continuation of their show, and it worked really, really well.
That's Carolyn Walker, Response Marketing.
I have listened to an episode of Hackable, and I did enjoy it, as you suspected. I think the one I listened to, they were switching on smart switches remotely. So they plugged a blender in, and they were switching it on from somewhere else, and it was quite hilarious. So a really clever podcast, engaging, entertaining. And as Carolyn said, they went into it with entertainment front of mind. Make a podcast that people are going to want to listen to, they're going to enjoy, be entertained. Like Steve Pratt from Pacific Content said a few episodes ago, people don't want to listen to advertorial. And Carolyn totally got that from the outset, has created something that's really entertaining. And they don't mention the brand, but yet she said brand recall and sentiment scores have been through the roof.
There you go. And it's not just a great concept. Anyone can think of a great concept, but it's the execution of it. And that's hard to do, and that's why it's important to use experts in producing a podcast.
I'm not actually convinced that anyone can come up with a good idea. And I think that in this case, they're playing to their strengths. You've got the agency that their job is to come up with good ideas. They know their client, they know the audience of the client, but they then partnered up with an expert in the production side of things. And I think it's bringing together the skills of the agency versus the podcast producer, and having the brand obviously on board as well. That three-way partnership has produced an outstanding series.
That's right, absolutely. And one interesting thing she mentioned was going into it with the strategy with McAfee, not just as a standalone one season, but think about the long term, 2, 3, 4 seasons. And it kind of makes sense to continue that engagement. You've got an audience that loves what you do. Why would you stop it? And if you can think of that in the beginning and have the faith in believing that it's going to be good, carry that out over seasons.
Well, I would imagine Hackable will keep going because they've grown an audience where they're in the top 1% of all downloads. They're not going to stop now, are they?
That's right. It's funny, I took my daughter to watch Detective Pikachu last weekend. So Pokemon and all those characters, which I didn't know much about it, but I knew that my daughter loved that game. But this is the way brands are looking towards using content marketing or producing movies like Lego, where you're paying not just money, and there's a fair bit of money at the cinema these days, but also your time to watch effectively an advertisement for a company. I came away from that knowing more about Pokemon than I ever would have imagined.
Or wanted to, probably.
That's right. And an appreciation of why my daughter loves it. And who's going to be forking out the money to buy the next set of Pokemon cards? Well, yeah, it's going to be me. It's going to be Daddy. So how brilliant is that? And that's a lesson with, Hackable and the podcast or movies or any other form of entertainment or content marketing. It's really the way things are happening now, particularly for bigger business, but it doesn't have to be just for bigger business.
Well, you mentioned Lego. Have you been watching Lego Masters, which finished recently on Channel 9?
No, but I have watched the Lego movies with my daughter as well.
So Lego Masters is this show where it's a competition to build things out of Lego, and it was a ratings success. It's good family fun. There's no scandal. There's no drama. It's just a little bit of drama because it's a competition, but all good fun. The teams congratulate each other, and on the back of that, Lego sales have gone ballistic in the last few weeks.
There you go. But the thing is, with a lot of smaller businesses or middle-sized businesses, even larger businesses, they don't have the resources for a television show on a primetime television network.
No.
But that's where podcasting can fit in. You don't have to spend so much money.
So get your creative thinking hats on to the agencies out there listening. There are opportunities out there. You've just got to get the right client and the right idea, and you can have the success that we've talked about today.
Absolutely.
Well, that's it for another episode of Podcasting Essentials. For more about us and how we can help you use audio content to build engagement, go to be.com.au. From all of us at B Media Production, thanks so much for listening.